Welcome back to the deep dive. So, you know that feeling when you're trying to really wrap your head around a super complex problem?
Oh, yeah.
It could be anything, right? Climate change, the economy, maybe even just the culture at your company.
Right.
And you just feel stuck. You feel like you have two options. You can either drill down into these tiny, tiny details until you're completely lost in the weeds,
Mhm.
or you step way back to see this big picture, but it's so blurry and vague that it doesn't actually help you do anything.
It's the classic intellectual dilemma, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's been raging for, centuries. It's that scientific shouting match between reductionism, focus on the parts,
Mm.
and holism, focus on the whole.
Exactly. And the thing is, while that dichotomy, it's powerful, we're finding that in the 21st century, it's mostly just getting in our way.
It really is.
Reductionism often means you miss the forest entirely. And holism, well, it can mean you lose any kind of empirical anchor in the trees.
Well, yeah, and the terms themselves have just acquired so much baggage, right?
Mm.
Philosophical, emotional. They don't give us precise, actionable tools anymore.
Yeah.
They force you into choosing a side when the reality of any complex system is that you desperately need both perspectives.
That choice is always incomplete. I mean, when people say they're being holistic, what does that even mean?
It's so vague.
Does it mean looking at the context or just kind of feeling the vibe of the situation?
Exactly. And on the other side, when someone says they're reductionist,
Yeah.
they're often committing to this really outdated worldview, this idea that the whole is nothing but the sum of its parts.
Right. And they just dismiss anything new or surprising that might emerge from the interaction.
Which where all the interesting stuff happens.
Yeah.
We desperately need new language that forces some intellectual rigor, methodological completeness.
And that is why we dove deep into a framework designed specifically to resolve this ambiguity. It's called the Integral Holism Framework.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really a conceptual toolkit that transforms this old, tired debate from a philosophical argument into a guided scientific process.
I love that. It replaces that philosophical vagueness with precise, measurable methodological commitments. It's what happens when philosophy kind of grows up and gives you a clear guide for actually analyzing complexity.
So our mission for this deep dive is to synthesize all this material into, well, the ultimate cheat sheet for you. If you want to walk away with a sophisticated, ready-to-use framework for analyzing anything complex, this is it.
We're basically building a blog post in real time.
We are. We're building a compelling, scannable listicle, we're calling it, the 5 concepts that finally resolve science's biggest dilemma.
That's a good title.
I think so. So if you're ready to trade in those vague philosophical labels for some crystal clear scientific action steps, let's get started.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to jump straight into the conceptual refresh. The Integral Holism Framework, it doesn't try to fix the old terms. It just replaces them entirely. And with new concepts that describe a methodology, not just a philosophical attitude.
Which is the key.
So for our listicle headline for this first part, I'm thinking something like, forget reductionism and vague holism. Here are the 2 new methodologies.
I like it. It's direct.
All right, concept number 1. We are ditching the loaded term reductionism, and we're replacing it with particularism.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why is this more than just, a synonym? Why the change?
It's such a crucial upgrade in precision. Reductionism as a term, historically, it's often used just to describe the process of breaking things down, analysis.
Right.
But it also carried this deep philosophical commitment, particularly to what's called mechanistic materialism.
The idea that the universe is just a big clockwork machine.
Exactly. The idea that complex things are nothing but their simplest parts.
And that's the trap. That's the famous quote, right?
Wow.
The whole is nothing more than the sum of its parts.
That's the one. And by switching to the term particularism, we strip away all that philosophical baggage. We're no longer talking about a belief system.
Okay.
We are now only naming the methodological commitment to the primacy of the individual fundamental element.
Yeah.
It's not a belief that the system is only the parts.
But a recognition that the system requires the parts. You can't ignore them.
You can't. You have to start there.
So the definition becomes really crisp then. Particularism is the methodological approach that isolates the discrete constituent parts, the particulars, and defines the system by the intrinsic properties of those elements.
Yeah.
It's basically saying, look, we have to analyze what these pieces are and what they inherently do, in isolation before anything else happens.
And that makes it the necessary first step, what the framework calls the analytical phase of any inquiry. You analyze the system, you separate the variables, and you establish the baseline physical reality.
Okay, so the key question for this phase is always what?
It's always, what are the foundational building blocks and what are their inherent properties that stay constant regardless of the context?
I really appreciate that distinction. It moves the whole thing away from an ideology, a belief system, and toward just a concrete investigative step.
You can't argue with it.
You can't argue with the need to identify the pieces of the puzzle.
And that's the power of the redefinition. The source material really emphasizes that particularism provides the necessary conditions for the system's existence. It's the raw materials.
Can you give us a concrete example?
Sure. In, say, molecular biology, you must identify the exact DNA sequence. You have to determine the precise, folded-up, three-dimensional structure of a protein.
Okay.
And then you have to measure the enzymatic activity of that specific component. If you don't know those intrinsic properties, you have no foundation for understanding what it does in a cell.
So particularism grounds the whole inquiry in empirical, measurable facts.
It tells us what we have to work with before the interaction even begins.
It's the grounding mechanism. But, and this is the key, stopping there, which so many fields have done historically, it means you only have a list of ingredients. You don't have the recipe, and, you can't eat the ingredients.
Right. A pile of flour and sugar is not a cake.
Exactly. Which brings us to concept number 2 in our listicle. We are replacing that often mushy, kind of vague concept of holism with a much more precise and dynamic term, relationalism.
Yes.
So now we're shifting the focus from the static idea of the whole to the dynamic architecture that actually creates the whole.
This might be the most necessary conceptual leap in the whole framework. Holism, historically, often felt like, a fuzzy philosophy. It encouraged researchers to consider the context, which is good advice, but not a methodology.
Right. It's not a set of instructions.
No, relationalism is a hard science methodology.
Yeah.
It demands that we focus on the architecture of flow and interaction, rather than just admiring the finished structure from afar.
So how does the framework define this methodology specifically?
Relationalism is defined as the methodological approach that focuses systematically on the interactions, the connections, the organizational structure, the context, and the dynamic feedback loops between the parts. It is a commitment to studying the relationships as the primary determinant of system behavior.
I have to pause here because I want to challenge this a bit. This sounds an awful lot like systems theory, which, has been around for decades.
Good question.
How is relationalism different from just saying, hey, everything is connected?
That's a fantastic question, and it's essential for anyone trying to learn this. Systems theory often describes the world relationally, that's true. But relationalism, as it's defined in this framework, is explicitly the synthetic phase of inquiry.
Meaning what?
Meaning it's designed to operate after the particularist analysis has already provided the concrete component.
So it's a sequence.
It's a sequence. It's a targeted, systematic methodology, a formal synthesis. The key question for the relationalist isn't just what's connected. It's how are the building blocks we've already identified connected? And what structure, rules, and constraints do their relationships create?
Okay. That makes it an active, structured approach, not just a perspective. So if particularism gave us the raw materials,
The necessary conditions.
then relationalism gives us the blueprint, the rules of engagement, the dynamic forces.
It provides the sufficient conditions for the system's unique emergent behavior. Let's go back to that cellular example.
Okay.
It's not enough to know the cell has a bunch of specific proteins. That's particularism. Relationalism demands mapping the entire metabolic network, or the signaling cascade, the interconnected pathway.
You have to follow the chain reaction.
You have to. You must study how protein A activates protein B, which then feeds back to inhibit pathway C. It's the study of moment-by-moment organization and self-regulation.
So, let me see if I've got this. A scientist who is only doing particularism might isolate a single protein and say, this protein causes this disease.
Yep, a classic approach.
And a scientist who's only doing relationalism might map a network and say, this network is unstable.
Also a classic approach, just from the other side.
But the framework insists that true understanding requires both the structure and the components that make up that structure.
Precisely. They're two halves of the same empirical reality. They are mutually essential. And it's that mutual necessity that leads us directly to the ultimate synthesis.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. So we have our two rigorous methodologies now. Particularism, let's call it P, and relationalism, R.
P and R.
Now we get to the absolute core of the framework. And for our listicle, the headline for this section has to be something like, the secret sauce of understanding, integral holism, and the mystery of emergence.
Oh, I like that. Secret sauce.
So the ultimate goal, the state of understanding we're all aiming for, is integral holism. And this isn't just about, mashing P&R together. It's about a very specific integrated outcome.
That's exactly right. Integral holism isn't another choice on the methodological menu. It's not P, R, or IH.
Right.
It is the final, comprehensive state of understanding that you achieve when the analytical findings of particularism are successfully merged and reconciled with the synthetic findings of relationalism.
The framework gives us a clear formula here, which I love because it reduces all this complexity to a tangible goal. Integral holism equals particularism plus relationalism. IH equals P plus R.
And that word integral is doing all the heavy lifting there. It insists that a complete view is impossible without factoring in both the intrinsic, isolated properties of the parts and the dynamic, evolving structure of their relationships.
The source material uses a great analogy for this synthesis, the orchestra.
It's a perfect analogy.
Let's elaborate on that because it makes it so clear.
Okay, so particularism is the study of the sheet music, right? The notes on the page. It's the physics of the individual instruments, the specific talent of each musician, the acoustic profile of a single violin.
All necessary but totally isolated knowledge.
Totally isolated. Now, relationalism is the study of the conductor's cues, the precise timing and synchronization between musicians, the rules of harmony, the interplay between the brass section and the strings.
It's the structure of their cooperation.
It is. So what's integral holism?
It's the music itself, the actual experience of the symphony, the emotional, harmonic, acoustic phenomenon that is only realized when the components, the notes, the instruments engage in those structured, dynamic relationships defined by the score and the conductor.
You got it.
You absolutely cannot explain the power of a symphony by just listing the notes on the page.
Never. And you can't explain it by just drawing a diagram of the orchestra's seating chart either. It's the acknowledgement that one without the other leads to an incomplete and maybe even a false understanding. You risk a kind of intellectual blindness if you only focus on one.
So that brings up the big why. Why do we need this marriage of methodologies? Why can't we just keep the analyses separate and call it a day?
Because of the central mystery of all complex systems.
Which is?
Emergent properties. And this is the real takeaway 3 for our listicle.
Define that for us.
Emergent properties are the novel, often surprising characteristics of a system that cannot be linearly predicted or deduced or fully explained by merely summing up the properties of the individual parts.
They are irreducible to the components alone.
Completely.
We mentioned wetness earlier. Water is the classic, simple example of this, right?
It's the perfect one. An H2O molecule by itself is not wet. Wetness, solvency, surface tension, these are all properties that only emerge when billions of those molecules interact under very specific relational rules, like hydrogen bonding.
And then at the biological level, the ultimate emergent property has to be consciousness.
Oh, absolutely. A single neuron or even a small cluster of neurons is not conscious.
Yeah.
There's no consciousness molecule.
Mm-hmm.
Consciousness arises from the incredibly complex, massively interconnected, and self-regulating dynamic relationships that flicker across billions of neurons. If you want to even begin to explain consciousness, you must use integral holism.
So this phenomenon of emergence, the source material argues, is what literally forces scientists out of their isolated silos and demands they integrate their approaches.
It's the ultimate referee.
Let's talk about the pitfalls of ignoring this. What happens if you try to explain an emergent property with just one of the methods?
Okay, let's consider the danger of pure particularism first. If a scientist is committed to that old mechanistic materialism, they believe consciousness must reside in a specific part, specific molecule, specific neuron.
The consciousness cell.
Exactly. And when they inevitably fail to find it, the emergent property consciousness, it appears mysterious. It seems magical, almost non-physical, because they are searching for a particularist source for what is a relational phenomenon.
They're looking for the wetness dial on an individual oxygen atom.
And it simply isn't there.
So what's the danger on the other side, focusing only on relationalism?
The danger of pure relationalism is that the models you build can become abstract. They can become almost ethereal.
Okay.
You might have a brilliant network map showing all the connections and the feedback loops in the brain. But if you don't anchor that network in the physical, particularist reality, The specific types of neurons, the energy constraints of metabolism, the immutable laws of chemistry.
Then your model can't be tested.
It can't be tested, it can't be verified, it can't be grounded in the physical world. It just becomes this elegant but ultimately empty diagram.
That's a fundamental limitation. So integral holism demands grounding. It insists that you have to explain that novel emergent behavior, whether it's consciousness or the stability of a stock market, as a function of both its structure, relationalism, and its constituents, particularism.
It's the only way to crack complexity without either dismissing the mystery or completely losing touch with empirical reality.
Okay, so we've established the necessity of integrating parts and their relationships, P plus R. But our source material points out this really crucial and honestly often overlooked limitation in how both P and R are traditionally used, even when they're deployed separately.
A blind spot.
A huge blind spot. It prevents even the most sophisticated researchers from fully capturing the dynamics of a system. This brings us to our fourth listicle concept, temporality. And the headline here should be something like, why static analysis fails. The system's history is half the equation.
I like that, because when we approach problems using just P or just R in isolation, there's this inherent intellectual gravitational pull.
Towards what?
Towards static spatial analysis. We are just naturally inclined to look at a snapshot of the system frozen in time.
Why is that? Let's break down that static bias for each one. With pure particularism, you're focused on properties that are often considered immutable or fixed, right?
Exactly. The mass of a particle, the chemical formula of a substance, the DNA sequence of a gene. These are presented as fixed spatial facts. They are defined regardless of the passage of time.
In relationalism, you'd think it would be more dynamic, but it suffers from a similar, though maybe more subtle limitation.
It really does. We often analyze the structural connections at a given moment. We look at the current network architecture, the current food web map, the organizational chart as it exists today.
We capture the topology in space, who's connected to whom right now.
Right. And even when we run complex simulations, they often restart their analysis from a simplified, clean initial state, ignoring the messy history that led up to it.
Okay, so if you're a doctor looking at a patient, particularism tells you the current blood pressure and their genetic markers.
Yep.
Relationalism tells you how their organs are currently interacting based on a scan. But both of those miss the most critical element,
Which is
the history of how those interactions evolved over the patient's lifetime. They miss the flow of the disease.
exactly. Isolated methodologies miss the dynamism of a living, evolving system. They miss the memory. If a system's behavior today is profoundly dependent on what happened yesterday, or 6 months ago, or 3 generations ago, then any analysis that just treats time as a container for fixed events will be fundamentally incomplete.
This is why integral holism is so demanding, because by forcing the synthesis of parts and connections, it necessitates the explicit examination of the system's patterns in time. And this is our takeaway 4, temporality.
And temporality, in this framework, it means recognizing and incorporating duration, evolution, historical contingency, and memory as inherent properties of every complex system.
We're not just talking about simple change over time. We're talking about something the source calls path dependency.
Path dependency. The state of the system today is profoundly shaped by the unique sequence of its past states. The path it took to get here matters.
There's this profound idea in the material that the relationships themselves have memory. A physical system, a social system, a biological system, its current architecture is not some arbitrarily organized thing. It's the result of all its past stress, all its growth, repair, and adaptation.
Let's go back to the cellular example. The efficiency of a metabolic network isn't just due to its current connections. It's due to how it evolved those connections over eons to handle historical nutrient scarcity or environmental toxins.
So if you look at two genetically identical cells, but you place them in different historical environments,
Their current relational performance will be radically different because their relationships have internalized different memories. They've learned different lessons.
the analogy of a personal relationship is perfect here. The way you interact with a lifelong friend is completely different from how you interact with a new acquaintance.
Right.
Even if the current topic of conversation, the particularist data, is the exact same. The relationship itself carries this massive, complex history, a memory that dictates the current and future dynamics.
And integral holism acknowledges this completely. The emergent property is not just a function of parts and relationships at a single point in time.
No.
It's a function of its full dynamic history. And this commitment, this is where it gets really interesting. It elevates the system from a three-dimensional model to what this source fascinatingly calls a four-dimensional entity, or sometimes a hyperobject.
Okay, we have to clarify hyperobject for our listener because that sounds like something straight out of science fiction.
It does, but it's a term from physics and philosophy. It refers to things that are so massively distributed across time and space that they're almost impossible to grasp as a single entity in our immediate sensory experience.
Like what?
Think of climate change, or the internet, or global capitalism. You can't touch them, you can't see them all at once, you can't define them in a snapshot.
They're processes as much as they are things.
Exactly. They are defined by their components, their connections, and their full temporal trajectory, their vast ongoing history. Integral holism demands we treat all complex systems, even smaller ones like a human organism, with this same 4D perspective.
So the takeaway is, if you miss the history, you simply miss half the explanation for the system's current behavior.
At least half.
Wow. Okay, that moves us from the abstract to the intensely practical. Because the ultimate test of any framework isn't how elegantly it's defined, right? It's about how effectively it clarifies real-world scientific problems. And this is where we really see the power of integral holism in action.
This section is critical. It really serves as a checklist. If you want a complete, predictive, and grounded explanation in any complex field, you have to be able to articulate the particularist view, the relationalist view, and then the integral synthesis. If you can't do all three, your understanding is probably half-baked.
Let's start with the most complex system we know of, the brain. Let's see how the framework breaks down the study of the mind and consciousness.
Okay, so historically, neuroscience began with extreme particularism. The whole focus was on identifying the smallest discrete unit, the neuron doctrine.
Right.
Researchers studied individual neurons, specific neurotransmitters, and they tried to isolate specific brain regions, like the amygdala or the visual cortex. They were asking, what does this single piece of hardware do?
The goal was to localize function, to find the one part that does fear or does memory.
Exactly, and the pitfalls of that became pretty obvious, didn't they? You'd end up with these fMRI maps that showed a region lighting up when a person felt fear.
Sure.
But that didn't explain the full, rich, adaptive process of fear in the real world. It just gave you a correlation.
Right. That's where relationalism steps in, driven by modern technology.
The relationalist approach in neuroscience maps the connectome, the brain's vast wiring diagram. They examine large-scale brain oscillations, studying synchronous activity across distant regions.
And they map the elaborate, highly dynamic feedback loops that govern things like attention or memory retrieval.
Their question is, how does the coordination happen? They might find that fear isn't in the amygdala, but it's in the rapid, structured dialogue between the amygdala, the frontal cortex, and the hippocampus.
But again, if they stopped there, they would have a beautiful abstract network model that could, just as easily apply to a complex computer. It wouldn't be grounded in biology.
That's the limitation. So the goal of integral holism is to understand consciousness or memory or complex decision-making as an emergent product of this integration.
The synthesis.
The synthesis. It requires putting together the specialized particular functions of specific neurons and regions, the hardware, with the dynamic unified network interactions and adaptive plasticity, the software and the rules.
So integral holism would explain that the emergent self is a function of these specialized parts interacting in a way that generates this novel unified behavior.
Behavior that could not exist if the parts were just sitting in a pile, isolated. It demands grounding that abstract network activity in the specific physiological constraints of the neurons involved.
Okay, let's shift domains. Let's go to ecology, where the boundaries of the system are even harder to define, which makes the need for an integrated approach even clearer.
Absolutely. In ecology, the particularist is the one creating the inventory. They're out there cataloging individual species, measuring specific population sizes, analyzing the genetics and physiological tolerances of a single type of plant.
They're establishing the list of components and what each component is capable of on its own.
That's it. Then the relationalist steps back and examines the flow and the structure. They study the food web dynamics, the who eats whom matrix.
Okay.
They're tracking energy flow through trophic levels, mapping symbiotic relationships, modeling resource competition networks. They're looking at the health of the system through the lens of connection.
So where does integral holism come in? What's the emergent property we're trying to explain?
Profound emergent properties like ecosystem stability and resilience. Resilience, the ability of a forest or a wetland to recover from a major disturbance like a fire or a drought. that is not a property of one particular tree species.
Right.
Nor is it simply a function of how many connections exist in the food web.
So how does the integration explain it?
It explains stability as a direct function of both the diversity of species, the particulars, and the complexity of their interactions, the relational dynamics.
So you need both.
You absolutely need both. A resilient ecosystem often has a high diversity of species where multiple species can perform similar functions. That's particularism. And those species are highly interconnected in complex ways. That's relationalism. This allows the system to absorb a shock in one area by rerouting the flow of energy and resources through redundant pathways.
I see. So if you only look at the diversity of species, you miss how they actually collaborate to create stability.
And if you only look at the network of collaboration, you miss the foundational role of having different types of components to begin with. You need both to truly explain why one forest collapses from a drought and another one thrives.
And finally, let's take it to sociology, where the components are conscious humans, which makes the system dizzyingly complex. This is often where the battle between the parts and the whole has been most vicious.
Oh, absolutely. Historically, sociological analysis has been plagued by this tension between what's called methodological individualism,
The particularist view.
the particularist view, and things like structural functionalism, which is a relationalist view.
Let's detail that particularist approach, methodological individualism. What does that look like?
This approach focuses solely on the individual. It analyzes individual rational choices, attitudes, psychological motivations, localized interactions.
So the questions are like, why did this specific individual commit this specific crime?
Exactly. Or why did this specific voter choose this specific candidate? The focus is always on finding the cause and the properties of the individual component.
And the relationalist pushes back hard on that. They argue that individual choice is secondary, or at least heavily constrained by the network it's embedded in.
They do. They study the invisible structures, cultural norms, power dynamics, economic class systems, institutional constraints. They might argue that a city's crime rate is determined not by individual pathology, but by poverty and lack of social mobility that are inherent in the relational structure of that city.
And if you're purely a relationalist, you might conclude that individual free will barely even matters.
You might. People are just playing out roles dictated by the social script. The models can become very deterministic and, frankly, dehumanizing.
So integral holism has to come in and bridge this huge ideological gap to explain emergent social phenomena, like, say, collective action or widespread social unrest.
And it does so beautifully. Integral holism understands that social unrest is a massive emergent property. It arises from the psychological state of individuals, the frustration, the alienation, the personal motivations of the particulars.
But those individual states are constrained and channeled and massively amplified by the established social relations and structures.
The structure acts as the amplifier.
Exactly. Individual stress exists, that's the particulars fact, but it takes a highly polarized relational structure, one that lacks functional feedback loops for change, to turn that individual stress into a collective behavioral pattern, a massive wave of unrest that no single person intended or could control.
The integral view provides a complete, human-centered, and structural explanation at the same time. It's really the required maturity for social science to move forward.
Okay, that brings us to our final and maybe the most mind-bending application of this framework. If it can resolve some of the biggest philosophical quandaries in fundamental physics, then we know we have a truly complete framework.
The ultimate test.
Our final listicle takeaway and headline is the mind-bending grand finale, how the framework solves the quantum paradox.
And we are talking about the paradox. Particle-wave duality in quantum physics. It's the most enduring scientific mystery of the last century.
Right. How can a fundamental entity, like an electron or a photon, be localized and discrete, a particle, and spread out and probabilistic a wave at the exact same time?
It seems like a flat contradiction.
It does. And the conventional solution in physics is often just to accept the mystery. The entity's identity depends on how you measure it. If you set up an experiment to look for a location, you find a particle.
And if you set up an experiment to measure interference and probability, you find a wave.
So it seems like this fundamental contradiction that science just has to live with.
And this is where the Integral Holism Framework offers such a profound conceptual tool. It reframes the entire dilemma from a contradiction into a comprehensive requirement.
How does it do that? The framework maps these two traditional physics viewpoints perfectly onto our new methodologies. Let's start with the particle.
Okay, When we view a quantum entity as a particle, we are employing the particularist perspective. We're focusing on the discrete, localized measurement, that fixed dot that hits the photographic plate.
Okay.
This approach is trying to capture the entity's intrinsic measurable coordinates, its mass, its charge. It's looking for its fixed, necessary conditions for existence at that single moment.
So it's the attempt to isolate and define the component, and conversely, the wave.
The concept of a wave, especially the wave function in quantum mechanics, is the very definition of the relationalist view. The wave function doesn't describe where the particle is. It describes its potential. It describes its relationship with its entire environment, its probability distribution, the interference patterns it creates, its interactions with the whole experimental apparatus. It captures the relational potential, not a fixed point.
The sufficient condition for its behavior within the field?
Precisely.
This is genuinely revolutionary in its simplicity. So the paradox isn't in the object itself, but in our outdated conceptual language.
That's the core insight. That's takeaway 5. The contradiction only arises because we are attempting to force the quantum entity into only one of these conceptual categories at a time. We treat the particle language and the wave language as if they are mutually exclusive.
But the object itself isn't choosing to be one or the other.
Exactly. Integral holism suggests that the quantum object is a fundamental unity that inherently possesses both particularist localized position and relational contextual potential attributes simultaneously.
So the duality isn't a flaw or a contradiction in the object? It's a requirement for a complete description of the system's nature.
You need both languages to describe the reality.
So if you try to talk about a quantum object only using particularism, you lose its contextual potential, the wave part.
And if you talk about it only using relationalism, you lose its physical grounding, the particle part.
So we, as observers and scientists, need both of these linguistic tools to fully describe what is, fundamentally, a unified, integrated entity.
The paradox dissolves when we realize P and R are not opposing beliefs, but complementary requirements for comprehensive knowledge.
This elevates the framework so far beyond just organizational theory or sociology.
It really does. It touches the very fabric of reality. It's just that integration is the core ontological requirement for existence itself.
Wow. That dive revealed so much more depth than that vague debate we started with. To quickly recap the 5 concepts for our listicle, the 5 concepts that define the Integral Holism Framework and resolve science's biggest dilemma.
Let's do it.
1. We replace reductionism with particularism. That's the rigorous focus on isolated parts and their intrinsic properties. 2, we replace that vague idea of holism with relationalism, the rigorous focus on dynamic connections and the system's architecture. 3, the goal is integral holism, P plus R, which is the state of understanding required to fully explain emergent properties.
The secret sauce.
4, this synthesis forces us to incorporate temporality, the system's memory, and its dynamic history.
A 4th dimension.
And 5, this entire framework offers a clear resolution to the quantum paradox by showing that particle-wave duality is actually the required unity of particularist and relational attributes.
The ultimate conclusion that we can synthesize from this dive is that true scientific maturity isn't about choosing sides in that outdated debate, holism versus reductionism.
No.
It's about recognizing that they are both indispensable phases of any good inquiry. We have to cultivate the intellectual humility to skillfully employ analysis particularism to uncover the fundamental components.
And synthesis relationalism, to map the intricate, time-dependent relationships that bring those components to life. So we can finally stop arguing about which view is right and start asking the more rigorous grown-up question. Are we being rigorous enough in both our analysis and our synthesis?
Absolutely. And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the learner, to carry forward with you.
Okay.
Think about the most complex problem that's currently facing you. It could be professional, societal, personal, anything. If your current understanding of that problem lacks a thorough, rigorous accounting of either the foundational parts, the particulars, or the dynamic temporal interactions between them, the relational aspect, are you destined to always miss the emergent property you're actually seeking?
In other words, are you missing half the map required to solve the problem?
Are you trying to solve an integrated problem with a fractured mind?
Something to think about. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.